Everyone knows about U-boats, the sleek, dangerous submarines that prowled the Atlantic and terrorized Allied convoys, the wolf packs that hunted in darkness, the commanders whose names became legend. But almost nobody knows about the paperwork. And I don't mean that as a joke, because inside that paperwork, buried in the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich's most feared weapon, was one of the most calculated acts of institutional self-preservation in naval history. A system so quietly clever that it survived the entire war, fooled investigators for decades, and only started revealing its full secrets when researchers began comparing documents that were never supposed to be compared side by side. U-boat commanders kept 2 logs, not because they were disorganized, not because the Navy had a redundant filing system. They kept 2 logs because one was meant to be seen and one was meant to survive, and the difference between those 2 documents could be the difference between a medal and a war crimes tribunal. If that sounds like something worth understanding, stay with me. Because this story goes deep, into the command bunkers of Lorient, into the classified archives of the British Admiralty, into the legal maneuvering at Nuremberg, and into the water itself, where the truth of what U-boat crews actually did sits at the bottom of the ocean, alongside everything they were ordered to forget. Subscribe if you want history told the way it actually happened. Not cleaned up, not softened, just the truth, documented and delivered. Let us start at the beginning, because to understand why U-boat commanders kept duplicate logs, you have to understand what a U-boat log actually was, what it was supposed to be, what it was legally required to be, and what it actually became in practice. The Kriegstagebuch, literally the war diary, was the official operational log of every German naval vessel. Every U-boat that put to sea carried one. It was a mandatory, legally binding document that was supposed to record every significant event of a patrol in real time. Position fixes, weather conditions, fuel and torpedo counts, crew status, contacts with enemy vessels, attacks made, results observed. All of it written down as it happened, in ink, signed by the commanding officer. The log was not optional. It was not a personal journal. It was a military record, the property of the German Navy, subject to review by the Kriegsmarine High Command, and in theory, an objective account of everything that transpired at sea. In theory. The reality was more complicated from the moment Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare, and commanders began operating in the legally murky waters of wartime Atlantic, where the rules of engagement shifted constantly, where orders came down verbally through back channels, and where the things being done in the name of naval warfare did not always look good on paper. The log system had a fundamental structural vulnerability built right into it. The process of submitting the log to high command required the document to physically leave the submarine. When a U-boat returned to port, the Kriegstagebuch was handed over, reviewed by the flotilla commander, transmitted up the chain of command, and eventually archived at U-boat headquarters under Admiral Karl Dönitz. The original log went ashore, the commanding officer kept a copy, and right there, in that simple bureaucratic division, was the seed of everything that followed. Because a copy is not the same as an original, and when the person holding the copy is also the person who wrote both versions, and when the stakes of what those versions say are high enough, the temptation to make sure they say slightly different things becomes almost irresistible. Let us talk about what was actually happening out there in the Atlantic, because the context matters enormously. U-boat warfare in the Second World War was not a clean, honorable contest between submarines and warships. It was a brutal campaign of economic strangulation aimed at starving Britain into submission by cutting its supply lines. Merchant ships carrying food, fuel, weapons, and soldiers were the targets, and the men sailing those ships were not combatants in the traditional military sense. They were sailors, often civilian sailors, working on vessels flying the flags of many different nations. International maritime law, specifically the prize regulations and the Hague Conventions, had rules about this. Rules that had been developed over centuries of naval warfare to provide some minimum protection to survivors at sea. Rules that said submarines could not simply sink a merchant vessel without warning. Rules that required the attacking vessel to ensure the safety of the crew before sending the ship to the bottom. Rules that, in the age of the surface warship, made at least some logistical sense. Rules that, in the age of the submarine, became almost impossible to follow without destroying the military effectiveness of the weapon entirely. A surface submarine offering a warning to a merchant ship was a submarine that could be rammed. That could be fired upon by deck guns. That could be reported to nearby warships by radio. The tactical utility of the submarine depended almost entirely on stealth and surprise. The moment you surfaced and announced yourself, you were no longer a submarine in any useful military sense. You were a small, slow, thin-hulled boat sitting on the surface of the ocean, surrounded by people who wanted to kill you. Donitz understood this from the beginning. And so, by 1939, and certainly by 1940, the orders being given to U-boat commanders were not the orders written in any official directive. They were not the orders that would survive legal scrutiny. They were verbal instructions, suggestions, understandings, and a careful system of not asking the question you did not want answered. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. Donitz would not issue a written order to sink survivors. He did not have to. Instead, he cultivated an atmosphere in which commanders understood what was expected of them, in which the official rules of engagement as written in formal directives were carefully preserved in their sanitized form, and in which the actual conduct of operations was governed by a completely different understanding that existed nowhere in writing. Except, sometimes, in the log. Because the log had to be written in real time, and real time means recording what actually happened, not what should have happened according to the official version. A commander who attacked a merchant ship and left survivors in the water had to write something. And what he wrote, if he wrote the truth, could later be compared to the official rules of engagement and found to be in direct violation of them. What he wrote, if he wrote a sanitized version, might not match what surviving crew members later reported. What he wrote, if he wrote nothing at all about the incident, created a suspicious gap that any competent investigator would immediately notice. The solution, developed not through any formal policy, but through the organic adaptation of men who understood the stakes, was the duplicate system. Write two versions. One that contains the operational truth in enough detail to satisfy internal review, to allow headquarters to assess the effectiveness of the patrol, to give Donitz the information he needed to manage his campaign, and one that, if it ever left the secure world of Kriegsmarine archives and ended up in front of a court, told a different story. Or told less of one, or left out the parts that mattered most. To understand how this worked in practice, you need to understand the daily rhythm of a U-boat patrol. Submariners lived in an almost indescribable compression of time and space. The interior of a Type Vieck U-boat, which was the backbone of the German submarine fleet, was approximately 67 meters long and about 6 meters wide at its widest. Inside that space, roughly 44 to 52 men lived, worked, slept, ate, and waited. Torpedoes were stored in the same compartment where sailors slept. The kitchen was roughly the size of a closet. There was no privacy, no silence, no separation between work and rest. In this environment, the commanding officer wrote his log in the control room or at a small desk near the radio equipment. He wrote it by hand in a standardized format. He recorded positions using grid references from the German naval grid system, BF for Biscay, AL for the Central Atlantic, and so on. He noted times in military format. He described contacts, maneuvers, and attacks with the precision of a professional officer trained to observe and report accurately. This was not casual writing. This was formal documentation under pressure, in a moving vessel, often under depth charge attack, in conditions of sleep deprivation and extreme stress. And yet, commanders managed it. They managed it because they had to. Because failing to maintain the log was not an option, and because, crucially, they had already internalized the system of what to write and what not to write. The verbal intelligence about what the log should and should not contain was transmitted through the culture of the U-boat arm itself. During training at the submarine school at Pillau or Gotenhofen, young commanders were not formally taught to falsify records. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous, too likely to produce documentation of the instruction itself. Instead, they learned through example, through the mentorship of more experienced officers, through the careful reading of patrol reports from previous patrols that were circulated as training material within the Kriegsmarine. Reading those reports, a careful student could see exactly what the approved format looked like. He could see how contacts were described. He could see how attacks were reported. He could see, crucially, how the aftermath of attacks was handled in the language of the log. And what he would notice, if he was paying attention, was a consistent absence, a systematic gap in what the logs recorded. A silence around precisely the moments when international maritime law would have required certain actions to be taken. The sinking itself would be recorded. The torpedo firing, the explosion, the observation of the vessel going down. All of that would appear in the log with precision and professional detachment. What happened next, whether the commander surfaced and checked for survivors, whether he offered assistance, whether he directed survivors to the nearest land, or whether he simply motored away and submerged and left whoever was in the water to their fate, that part was handled through omission or through carefully calibrated language. Certain phrases became standard, attempted to render assistance but forced to dive by approaching aircraft. Surfaced briefly, no survivors visible. Sea conditions precluded rescue operations. These phrases were technically defensible. They could be explained. They could be supported by reference to genuine tactical constraints that any U-boat commander faced, and they created a legal buffer around the commander's actual decisions without requiring him to lie outright in a way that could be easily disproven. The copy that stayed on board, the commander's personal version of the log, sometimes contained more. Sometimes it contained the unvarnished version of events, recorded in the immediate aftermath of an action, while the details were still precise and the commander's instinct was still to document accurately. Sometimes it contained the margins, the handwritten notes, the supplemental entries that never made it into the official submitted version. Sometimes it simply contained different dates, different times, different positions, that told a different story about where the boat was and what it was doing when the incident occurred. The submitted version, the one that went ashore and entered the official Kriegsmarine archive system, was the cleaned copy. The version that had passed through the commander's self-censorship filter. The version optimized for both operational usefulness to units and legal defensibility in case anyone ever looked too closely. This was not unique to any one commander. This was systemic. It was practiced across the entire U-boat arm with a consistency that suggests not just individual initiative, but collective understanding. And the man at the center of that collective understanding, the man whose approval or disapproval shaped the culture of the entire force, was Admiral Karl Donitz. Donitz is one of the most studied figures in naval history, and one of the most contested. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely gifted naval tactician. His development of Wolfpack tactics, his management of the logistics of a submarine campaign being fought simultaneously across an ocean, his understanding of the morale requirements of men living in those terrible conditions, these were real achievements. He was also a committed Nazi, a true believer in Hitler's vision of Germany, and a man who spent the years after the war systematically constructing a version of his own biography that bore a complicated relationship to the historical record. On the question of the logs, Donitz's position was carefully maintained throughout the Nuremberg trials and for the rest of his life. He maintained that the orders given to U-boat commanders were lawful, that the conduct of the submarine campaign was conducted within the boundaries of international law, as reasonably interpreted under the conditions of total war, that whatever irregularities existed in the historical record were the product of individual commanders making individual decisions under combat stress, not the product of any systemic policy authorized from above. The logs, or at least the official versions of the logs that had survived and been captured by Allied forces, were central to this defense. Because those official logs, read in isolation, told a story that was just defensible enough. Not pristine, not without incident. There were entries that raised questions, passages that described events in ways that did not quite add up. But taken as a whole, the submitted logs from German submarine operations could be presented as the record of a force that had, more or less, followed the rules. The problem for Donitz, and for that version of history, was the duplicates. Not every U-boat commander was equally disciplined about the dual log system. Some kept genuine personal diaries alongside the official log. Some made carbon copies of entries that later diverged from the submitted version. Some wrote supplemental reports that were meant for internal Kriegsmarine review only, never intended to leave the secure world of the submarine base command structure, and which therefore contained a level of candor that the official logs were carefully designed to avoid. When the war ended and Allied forces moved into the German U-boat bases at Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, and the Norwegian bases at Bergen and Trondheim, they found a chaotic mixture of documentation. Some records had been deliberately destroyed, some had been hastily removed. Some had been abandoned in the rush of the final collapse of German military organization in the spring of 1945, and some, scattered through filing cabinets, personal lockers, and administrative offices, were duplicates, alternates, and supplemental versions that had never been intended to be seen by anyone outside the Kriegsmarine. The British Admiralty's intelligence teams, who were by 1945 deeply experienced in the analysis of captured German naval documents, immediately understood the significance of what they were looking at. These were not copies in any simple administrative sense. These were alternative texts, documents that described the same patrols, the same operations, the same specific incidents from the official logs, but with different details, different interpretations, different silences, and different admissions. The most significant of these divergences clustered around a specific category of incident: the aftermath of merchant ship sinkings, the moments immediately following an attack when the submarine was at its most vulnerable and when the human beings who had been on the target vessel were at their most desperate. And it was in those moments, in the gap between what the official log recorded and what the duplicate or supplemental records revealed, that the evidence of systematic war crimes became legible. The Laconia incident is probably the most documented and most discussed of these moments, and it serves as a useful lens through which to understand the whole system. In September 1942, the U-156, under the command of Werner Hartenstein, attacked and sank the British troopship Laconia in the South Atlantic. The vessel was carrying over 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, British soldiers, civilians, and crew. After realizing the scale of the disaster and discovering the Italian prisoners among the survivors, Hartenstein made the unusual decision to surface and begin rescue operations. He broadcast an open radio message in English announcing his position and requesting assistance. Dönitz, informed of the situation, initially authorized the rescue and directed other submarines in the area to assist. What followed was the famous Laconia incident, which ended when an American B-24 Liberator attacked Hartenstein's submarine while it was conducting rescue operations with lifeboats and survivors on its deck. Dönitz then issued what became known as the Laconia Order, or the Triton Null Order, which explicitly forbade German submarines from attempting to rescue survivors of sunken vessels. The text of that order was, at Nuremberg, the subject of intense legal argument. The prosecution argued it was an explicit authorization of the murder of survivors. The defense, led by Dönitz's lawyer Otto Kranzbühler, argued it was a purely tactical order driven by the demonstrated danger of submarine rescue operations, not an instruction to kill anyone. The tribunal ultimately accepted a version of the defense argument, acquitting Dönitz of the specific charge of ordering the killing of survivors, though they found him guilty on other counts. But the logs told a more complicated story. The official log of U-156 and the subsequent operational reports filed by Dönitz's headquarters described the Laconia incident in terms consistent with the defensive version: the rescue attempt, the attack by the American aircraft, the tactical necessity of the subsequent order. What the supplemental records, the internal communications, and the command diary entries that were not part of the officially submitted log revealed was a pattern of discussion within U-boat command about the problem of survivors that preceded the Laconia incident by months, and that continued well after it, in terms that went considerably beyond purely tactical concern. The internal discussions, captured in those secondary documents, showed officers at U-boat headquarters wrestling explicitly with the question of what to do about survivors, in terms that had nothing to do with tactical risk, and everything to do with a deliberate policy of ensuring that no one who had been on a sunk vessel would survive to reach shore and report what had happened, to provide intelligence to Allied forces, or to take up space in hospital beds and replacement training pipelines that Germany would prefer to see depleted. This is not speculation. This is documented in the captured records. The language is euphemistic, as it almost always is in official documents that are describing things that everyone involved knows to be wrong. But the meaning is not ambiguous to anyone reading with the full context of what was actually being discussed. The official logs did not contain this discussion. The official logs contained, in their relevant entries, the approved language. The technical descriptions of attacks, the formulaic post-action summaries, the careful silences in precisely the moments when something uncomfortable had occurred. It was only by reading the official logs alongside the captured supplemental materials, the duplicates and the alternates and the internal correspondence, that the full picture became visible. And this is why the British Admiralty treated the captured duplicate logs as one of the most significant intelligence finds of the entire war. Not because of what they revealed about specific tactical operations, though they contained useful information about that as well, but because of what they revealed about the institutional structure of deception that had been built into the German submarine command system from very early in the war. The mechanics of the duplication process varied by commander and by patrol. Some commanders were meticulous about it. They maintained clearly separate documents, the official log and the personal log, with different information recorded in each. The official log went ashore as required. The personal log stayed locked in the commander's personal effects until it could be secured in private. In some cases, these personal logs were eventually buried, destroyed, or hidden in private homes in Germany when the tide of the war turned and the possibility of defeat became something that had to be practically planned for. Other commanders were less systematic. Their duplication was more informal. It existed in the gap between what was written in the official log and what was discussed verbally in the command room, in the reports made to flotilla commanders at debriefing sessions that were deliberately conducted without formal written record, in the culture of understood knowledge that permeated the U-boat arm and that was transmitted between officers without ever being written down in any form that could be produced as evidence. The debriefing sessions themselves were a critical part of the system. When a U-boat returned to port after a patrol, the commanding officer would sit down with the flotilla commander or his representative for an after-action review. In principle, this debriefing was supposed to produce a supplemental report that would accompany the official log to Donitz's headquarters. In practice, the debriefing served as the moment when the official version of events was finalized. When the commanding officer and his superior would review what was in the log and make decisions about what needed to be revised, what needed to be deleted, and what needed to be added to ensure that the document heading up the chain of command told the approved story. These debriefings were not formally recorded in most cases. The conversations that happened in those rooms, between tired commanders and their flotilla chiefs, in the offices of submarine bases on the French Atlantic coast, in the early years of the war when the U-boats were winning and the mood was triumphant, and in the later years when they were losing catastrophically and everyone involved was beginning to understand that accountability was coming, those conversations are mostly gone. They exist in fragments in the memories of surviving participants, in the occasional unguarded remark, preserved in a private letter or diary, and in the documentary archaeology of comparing what the official logs say with what they conspicuously do not say. There is another layer to this story that is less frequently discussed, but equally important. The role of the crew. Because a U-boat log was not written in isolation, the commanding officer was recording events that had been witnessed by anywhere from 44 to 52 other men. The engineering officer who noted the torpedo fired, the watch officer who recorded the sighting, the radio operator who logged the transmissions. The entire crew of a U-boat was present for the events being recorded, or at least for the sonic and physical evidence of those events, the explosion, the surfacing, the sounds that came from outside the hull. The crew knew what happened. And if the log said something different from what the crew knew had happened, that was a source of institutional risk. Not the kind of risk that materializes immediately, not while the war is ongoing and everyone is bound together by military discipline and the survival imperative of operating a submarine in a hostile ocean, but the kind of risk that materializes when the war ends and men start talking. This is why the culture of silence that Donitz cultivated was not just about the logs, it was about creating a crew-wide understanding that what happened on patrol stayed on patrol. That the operational reality of what U-boats did and were ordered to do was the property of the U-boat arm, and not to be shared with outsiders, not even with other branches of the German military, certainly not with any civilian authority, and absolutely not with any Allied investigator after the war. This culture of silence was remarkably effective. The post-war testimony of U-boat veterans, taken as a whole, shows a striking uniformity in what was remembered and what was not. Actions that were recorded in the official logs, or in the officially approved form of the record, were remembered and discussed with reasonable consistency. Actions that were not in the official logs, or that were in the logs only in sanitized form, tended not to appear in post-war testimony either. The official log, in other words, did not just record the approved version of events. It became the memory template, the version of the past that was collectively agreed upon and maintained. This is not entirely surprising from a psychological standpoint. Human memory is reconstructive, not archival. We do not store events like video recordings and play them back unchanged. We reconstruct our memories each time we access them, and we reconstruct them in ways shaped by our current context, our current needs, and the social frameworks that we share with the other people whose memories overlap with ours. When an entire community of men shares a strongly enforced official version of events, and when the social and legal consequences of departing from that official version are severe, the official version tends to colonize private memory over time. What was done becomes what the log says was done, and what the log does not say becomes something that was not done. The British intelligence teams who worked with the captured U-boat documentation understood this dynamic well. They knew that the logs had to be read in the context of what they were. Not objective records, but constructed narratives. Documents produced within a system that had built-in incentives for a particular kind of selective truth-telling. The value of the duplicate and supplemental materials was precisely that they had been produced under different incentive structures, in moments when the commander was writing for internal consumption rather than for external review, and therefore told a different and more revealing story. The geographical dimension of the dual log system is also worth examining. The French Atlantic bases, Lorient above all, were the operational heart of the U-boat campaign from 1940 to 1944. These were not improvised facilities. They were purpose-built fortresses with massive reinforced concrete submarine pens that could withstand Allied bombing, with administrative complexes, crew recreation facilities, headquarters buildings, and secure archive rooms. The logs that went ashore went into those archive rooms. They were filed, cataloged, and retained in a system that was well organized and deliberately designed to be secure. When the Allied advance of 1944 made the French bases untenable, the Kriegsmarine undertook a systematic effort to evacuate the most sensitive documents. What could be moved to Germany was moved. What could not be moved was destroyed, but the evacuation was not perfect. The chaos of the military situation in the summer and fall of 1944 meant that the destruction was not complete, that the evacuation was not comprehensive, and that documents ended up in places and in states that had not been intended. The physical environment of the Atlantic also played a role in the history of the duplicate logs. U-boats that did not return from patrol, and by the end of the war, the losses were catastrophic. More than 3/4 of all German submariners who served in the war died, left their logs behind in two senses. The submitted log was in the archive. The personal copy, if the commander had one, was at the bottom of the ocean. The loss of those personal copies is not a neutral archival fact. It is a deliberate consequence of a system that distributed the sensitive information between a document that went ashore and a document that stayed on board, in a weapons platform that had an extremely high probability of being destroyed. Whether this was consciously calculated or simply a convenient structural feature is impossible to determine with certainty. The cynical reading, supported by the overall pattern of evidence about how the dual log system was used, is that placing the more candid version of the record in the more perishable location was not entirely accidental. The official version, stored in reinforced concrete vaults in France, was designed to survive. The personal version, kept on a submarine that had less than a 1 in 4 chance of surviving the war, was in a document that the system could afford to have destroyed. Let us now turn to the specific incidents where the divergence between official and supplemental records has been most clearly documented by post-war researchers. The case of U-852 and the Peleus incident is the most legally consequential example. In March 1944, the U-852, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinz Eck, sank the Greek merchant vessel Peleus in the South Atlantic. What followed was documented with unusual clarity because of the survival of witnesses. After the Peleus sank, Eck ordered his crew to kill the survivors in the water. The reasons Eck later gave were tactical, specifically his concern that the debris and survivors would leave a visible track that would enable Allied patrol aircraft to locate his submarine. The killing was carried out over several hours. Of the entire crew of the Peleus, only 3 men survived, clinging to wreckage and remaining hidden. The official log of U-852 recorded the sinking of the Peleus without any mention of the subsequent events. The log entry described the attack, noted the vessel as sunk, and moved on. Nothing in the submitted log indicated that anything had occurred after the ship went down. When Eck and U-852 were captured in May 1944, having been sunk by aircraft off the East African coast, the survivors of the submarine were interrogated. The survivors of the Peleus were also found, and the divergence between what the log said and what both sets of witnesses described was total. There was no reconciling the log entry with the survivor testimony. The log simply did not contain the events that multiple credible witnesses described in consistent detail. Eck was tried before a British military tribunal in Hamburg in October 1945 and was convicted of a war crime. He was executed by firing squad in November 1945. His case became one of the first successful war crimes prosecutions, arising specifically from U-boat conduct, and it established a precedent for the comparison of official logs with external evidence that would be applied in subsequent investigations. What the Peleus case demonstrated with particular clarity was the limitation of the dual log system as a legal protection strategy. The system worked under the assumption that the only documentation available to investigators would be the official submitted log. If the log said nothing happened and there were no survivors to contradict it, the log version of events could stand. But when there were survivors, when the human beings who had actually been present for the undocumented events were still alive to testify, the absence of the events from the log became not a protection but an indictment. Because the absence itself was evidence, the gap in the record was the shape of the crime. This is the core paradox of the duplicate log system. It was designed to create legal protection through omission, but omission only protects you when there is nothing to fill the space you have left empty. When witnesses exist, when debris tells a physical story, when the patterns of what the logs consistently do not say become visible enough to map, the empty space becomes the most damning evidence of all. The Allied intelligence teams who worked with the captured U-boat records understood this paradox well. They were not looking for explicit admissions. They were mapping absences. They were cataloging the categories of event that the official logs systematically did not record, and comparing those absences with the testimony of survivors, the reports of neutral vessels, the communications intercepts from Ultra, and the supplemental documentation from the captured duplicates. The ultra-intelligence deserves particular attention in this context. Throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were decrypting German naval communications with varying degrees of success. The communications between U-boats at sea and Donitz's headquarters provided a real-time running account of operations that was independent of the log system entirely. And that running account, preserved in the Bletchley decrypts, provided a third textual layer against which both the official logs and the supplemental materials could be compared. In some cases, the decrypted communications described events that appeared in neither the official log nor the submitted supplemental reports. In other cases, the communications confirmed the broad outline of events that both versions of the log recorded. And in the most revealing cases, the communications described events in terms that pointed toward the reality that the official log had been designed to obscure, using language in real-time operational messages that the commander knew would be read and approved by Dönitz, but that reflected the operational understanding of what was being done and why, in ways that the cleaned-up log version deliberately avoided. The relationship between the ultra decrypts and the U-boat logs created what intelligence analysts call a triangulation problem for the German system. Each of the three documentary streams, official log, supplemental materials, and communications intercepts, was designed to serve a different audience with a different set of expectations. The official log was designed for archival review and potential legal scrutiny. The supplemental materials were designed for operational review by superiors who needed to know the real story. The communications were designed for real-time operational purposes. When all three streams were available to researchers with the analytical tools to read them together, the convergences and divergences between them told a story that none of the individual streams contained. The British Admiralty's post-war exploitation of the captured U-boat records used exactly this triangulation approach. Teams of analysts worked through the records systematically, identifying incidents where the three streams diverged, flagging those divergences for further investigation, and building up a pattern analysis of what the U-boat command system was doing and how its documentation system was designed to obscure it. This work produced both tactical intelligence results, understanding German submarine tactics and capabilities, and legal intelligence results, building the evidentiary foundation for war crimes prosecutions. The tactical results were largely exploited immediately, and formed part of the British contribution to the broader Allied understanding of the Battle of the Atlantic. The legal results were fed into the Nuremberg process and into the series of subsequent military tribunals that tried individual German officers for specific acts. The Nuremberg proceedings against Dönitz occupied a unique position in the legal history of the U-boat campaign. Dönitz was tried as a major war criminal, one of the 24 senior German officials charged before the International Military Tribunal. The charges against him related both to conspiracy to wage aggressive war and to violations of the laws and customs of war, specifically in relation to the conduct of submarine warfare and the treatment of survivors. The documentary record, including the captured U-boat logs in both their official and supplemental forms, was central to the prosecution case. The prosecution used the documents to construct a narrative of systematic policy violation that went from Donitz's command directives down through the command structure to the individual actions of submarines at sea. The defense countered by attacking the interpretation of specific documents, by presenting alternative readings of ambiguous language, and by deploying the remarkable tactical countermove of introducing evidence that the United States Navy had conducted operations in the Pacific that were, by the standards being applied to Donitz, equally in violation of the laws of submarine warfare. This defense succeeded in a limited but crucial way. The tribunal found that the Laconia Order did not explicitly order the killing of survivors, and that American practice in the Pacific had been comparable to German practice in the Atlantic in certain respects. Donitz was convicted of waging unrestricted submarine warfare against neutral shipping, a conviction that carried a 10-year sentence rather than the death penalty that many observers had expected. He served his full sentence and was released in 1956, living until 1980. During which time he maintained his carefully constructed version of events with remarkable consistency. The defense strategy at Nuremberg had significant implications for how the U-boat log system was understood and discussed in the decades immediately following the war. By successfully arguing that the logs, in their official form, did not demonstrate explicit orders to violate the laws of war, the defense effectively reinforced the intended function of the dual log system. The official logs were read in a legally sanitized way, as the defense wanted them to be read. The supplemental materials and the divergences between documentary streams were partially addressed, but were presented in the most defensible light possible. It was not until the gradual declassification of British intelligence materials beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, and the subsequent scholarly work of naval historians who were able to read the full documentary picture, that the comprehensive story of the dual log system became visible in its full complexity. The work of historians like Michael Selewski, Timothy Mulligan, and Clay Blair, who spent years working through the captured Kriegsmarine records at the U.S. National Archives and the British Public Record Office, established the analytical framework through which the dual log system can be understood. Blair's work in particular, his massive 2-volume study of the U-boat war, represented a systematic comparison of the official logs with all available supplemental documentation that mapped the divergences with a precision that no previous historian had achieved. What that comparative work showed, when taken as a whole, was a picture considerably darker than the official logs alone would have suggested. The official logs depicted, broadly, a force operating under severe pressure, taking heavy casualties, conducting an increasingly desperate campaign against overwhelming odds. That picture was accurate, as far as it went. The supplemental documentation showed, additionally, a force operating under a command culture that had systematically placed tactical effectiveness above legal obligation from very early in the war, that had developed institutional mechanisms to obscure that choice from external scrutiny, and that had maintained those mechanisms with remarkable consistency across the entire force for the full duration of the conflict. The human dimension of this story should not be lost in the documentary analysis. The men who wrote these logs were not abstractions. They were young officers under enormous stress, operating in genuinely terrible conditions, watching their comrades die in numbers that by the later years of the war had become catastrophic. The average age of a U-boat commander in the later years of the conflict was remarkably young. Men in their mid-20s were commanding submarines and making decisions about life and death under depth-charge attack, surrounded by men who were terrified and exhausted and dependent on their leadership. The choice to maintain the duplicate log system, for commanders who exercised it, was not a comfortable bureaucratic decision made in an office. It was a choice made in the immediate aftermath of violence, in the lingering tension of an attack, while the submarine was still moving away from the debris field, and the men on the crew were still processing what had just happened. The act of writing the official log, of choosing what to put down and what to leave out, was an act of moral as well as practical consequence, performed under conditions that made moral clarity extremely difficult. This does not change what the system was or what it was used to conceal, but it is important to hold the human context alongside the documentary analysis, because the story of the duplicate logs is not a story about villains making obviously evil choices with comfortable detachment. It is a story about the way that institutional systems shape individual behavior, about how the cumulative weight of command culture, group loyalty, survival pressure, and carefully cultivated euphemism can produce outcomes that none of the individuals involved might have chosen in isolation. The commanders who wrote the cleaned official logs and kept the personal copies were operating within a system that had been built to produce exactly that behavior. They had been trained to do it. They had been rewarded for doing it. They had been surrounded by peers who were doing the same thing. The responsibility for the system itself, for the deliberate construction of a command culture designed to enable war crimes while maintaining documentary deniability, belongs to the men who built that system, the men who issued the orders without writing them down, the men who developed the template for the approved log language, the men who reviewed the submitted logs and knew what the absences in them meant. The log system also tells us something important about the nature of the U-boat campaign that goes beyond the question of war crimes. It tells us about the tension between the ideological and the tactical that ran through the German military throughout the war. The official, publicly maintained ideology of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine held that German forces fought with honor and within the laws of war. That ideology served important purposes: domestic legitimacy, international neutrality management, and the maintenance of a certain self-image among the officers themselves that made command psychologically sustainable. The reality of the campaign, which the supplemental documents and the duplicate logs partially illuminate, was that this ideology was substantially a performance. What was done at sea diverged from what was officially claimed to have been done at sea in ways that were too systematic to be explained by individual misconduct or combat stress. The divergence was managed and maintained by a documentation system that was itself systematic. And managing that documentation system required the active cooperation of officers at every level of the command structure. From the young commanders writing their logs in the control room, to the flotilla chiefs reviewing the submitted versions before they went to headquarters, to Donitz's own staff, who processed the final documents and understood very well what the gaps in them represented. This is what makes the duplicate log system historically significant beyond its specific legal implications. It is evidence of institutional lying, of a military organization that had constructed, deliberately and systematically, a mechanism for producing false historical records in real time, not after the fact, not in post-war memoirs or revisionist histories, but in the actual ongoing documentation of the war as it was being fought. There is a final dimension to this story that connects the past to the present in ways that extend well beyond the specific history of the Second World War. The dual log system of the U-boat arm represents a case study in what we might call the architecture of institutional deniability. The way that organizations operating in morally compromised territory construct documentation systems that are optimized not for accuracy but for legal protection, that build in gaps and absences at precisely the points where accurate recording would be most damning, and that create parallel streams of more honest documentation that are designed to be consumed internally and destroyed before they can reach external scrutiny. This architecture is not unique to the Kriegsmarine. It appears, in different forms and with different technical mechanisms, in the documented history of intelligence services, corporate fraud cases, political corruption investigations, and military misconduct inquiries across the 20th and 21st centuries. The specific form that it took in the